Hello, everyone, and good Yontif. It is a pleasure to be with you all today and to speak to you on the Middle East. My name is Michael Sharnoff, and I'm an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. The NISA Center, for those who aren't familiar, is one of 5 Department of Defense regional centers that focuses on strengthening United States relationships with our partner countries in the region. And in the case of the NISA Center, our area of responsibility is North Africa, the Levant region in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, Central and South Asia. And so by doing so, what we do is organize lectures and seminars, professional military education to help strengthen the United States relationship with our partner countries in the NISA region. I would like to talk today a little bit. I will provide a brief overview on some key Middle East issues, looking at how the Biden administration has approached some key Middle East issues, looking at Arab-Israeli relations broadly, looking at the Israelis and the Palestinians, and looking at Syria and Iran. But before I begin, just as a disclaimer to get out of the way, the following presentation or views that you are about to hear, these are my views and opinions, and they do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Defense or any federal agency. So with that, I will start. And again, I'll speak briefly for about 30 minutes or so, and then we can devote the remainder 15 minutes or so for questions and discussion. To begin, as we look at the current state of affairs in the Middle East, it is important to understand that the Middle East will always be an important region to the United States. However, when we look at some of the recent domestic and international events, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic, the January 6th insurrection on the US Capitol, which sought to overturn the election, and the Taliban's rapid takeover of Afghanistan, we have a lot of new challenges to contend with, and therefore we may have new priorities which will call our attention toward. Nonetheless, we can look at, even though the administration is just a little over 6 months, a little over half a year, we can already begin to get a sense of what US policy toward the region is. And there's a very important document that was released, which all US presidential administrations release. It is called the National Security Strategy. This was released by the Biden administration's White House in March 2021. And it offers us some insights and perhaps some clues as to what to expect in the Biden presidency. What are US national security goals and objectives? And regarding Israel, we can find a direct quote from the National Security Strategy, which says that in the Middle East, quote, "We will maintain our ironclad commitment to Israel's security while seeking to further its integration with its neighbors and resuming our role as a promoter of a viable two-state solution." So this gives you some sense by singling out Israel, at least publicly, at least verbally, that there is a continuity with prior US administrations of strong support and close cooperation between the United States and Israel. The National Security Strategy document also goes on to talk about other challenges and threats that are of strategic importance to the Biden administration, such as curbing Iranian influence and aggression in the Middle East, disrupting Al-Qaeda and other jihadist terrorist organizations, and addressing humanitarian crises, as well as a recommitment to humanitarian values, not just interests, but looking at values-based interests and ideals between the United States and our traditional allies and partners. The document also, which is very telling, goes on to say, quote, "We do not believe," that is the United States, "that military force is the answer to the region's challenges. And we will not give our partners in the Middle East a blank check to pursue policies at odds with American interests and values." So I think that's worth helping set the context and the stage of getting a better sense of, again, at least rhetorically, publicly, ideologically, where the Biden administration is toward the region. So what has happened when we look at a map of the Middle East over the past several years and since Joe Biden took office? What has happened, whether we look at relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors? Well, one of the biggest developments and achievements has been the Abraham Accords. And as a matter of fact, we have just approached the 1-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords, which was a historic signing of diplomatic relations, an agreement for Israel and several Arab and Muslim states to terminate their state of belligerency, normalize relations, and establish full diplomatic relations, including the exchange of embassies. And this set of agreements, the Abraham Accords, were brokered under the Trump administration between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. And the significance of these agreements is really hidden within the name itself, the Abraham Accords. It's a very telling name as a description of what the peace accords hope to achieve, and that is by signifying or invoking Abraham, the prophet Abraham. It's attempting to link and bring closer together the Arabs and Jews, the Muslims and Jews of the region under a common forefather in peace and security. This agreement so far, even though it's only been 1 year, has been very different when we look back and compare to the other 2 peace treaties that Israel signed with Egypt and Jordan. Israel's peace treaty with Egypt, which was in 1978, and Jordan's peace treaty in 1994, have by and large been peace treaties between governments. The treaties between the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan hope to be a much warmer peace and have a much more popular and widespread appeal to have a person-to-person relationship, not just a government-to-government, but greater cultural exchange at the population level, greater trade, greater inclusion and integration with Israel and its Arab and Muslim neighbors. These agreements, which I would argue haven't probably received the same amount of public attention as they probably would have under previous administrations or in the past, maybe when times were a little bit different and there weren't as many domestic challenges and intense polarization inside the country, it probably would have received a lot more attention than it already has. You don't hear as much about the Abraham Accords in the news as I suspect we would have in different times, whether it was under a Democratic or Republican administration. But the times that we're living in right now are very different, with a lot of different challenges that I previously mentioned, but they are nonetheless very important and very significant because they are a formal repudiation of the famous 3 no's that were issued at the Khartoum Arab League Summit immediately after the 1967 war, which advocated no peace no recognition and no diplomatic relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords have created a new framework for normalization with Israel, which we now see has the potential to expand toward other neighboring Arab and Muslim states. For so many decades after the 1967 war, when the Arab countries, at least publicly, vowed never to recognize Israel, for so many years after the Six-Day War, the conventional wisdom was that the Arab leaders, the Arab countries, would never make peace with Israel unless the Palestinian issue was resolved, which has evolved into an understanding by the majority of the Arab states, as well as the international community for that matter, that includes the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank in the Gaza Strip with Eastern Jerusalem as its capital. What is so significant about the Abraham Accords is that the UAE and the other Arab signatories never insisted or demanded for an independent Palestinian state, nor did the UAE, for that matter, who was the first signatory to the treaty, demand an Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank. All the UAE insisted on was that Israel refrain from annexing part of the West Bank, which former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to do a little over a year ago, to annex up to a third of the West Bank, including the strategic Jordan Valley. What the UAE insisted, even appealing to the Israeli public through an article in a major Israeli news outlet, was, we will normalize ties with you, but Israel should not annex territory in the West Bank. This is a far departure from the more stringent demands previously issued by Arab leaders for an independent Palestinian state and a total withdrawal of all Israeli armed forces behind the June 1967 boundaries. So this is very revealing and very profound, very significant. The Accords have created a new framework for a joint cooperation between Israel and the signatory Arab states in arms, in cybersecurity, command and control systems, to agricultural technology, as well as drip irrigation, in order, once again, to help better strengthen ties between Israel and its neighbors, and to accept Israel, something that Israel has long craved since its founding in 1948, to be perceived and viewed as a legitimate member in the Middle East. Motivations. Why did these accords and treaties happen now? Well, they did not happen overnight. These treaties and agreements were the result of many years, decades of back-channel communications involving Israel, the parties involved, and the United States. They signify a shift, looking at the Middle East, of the changing regional dynamics, regional players and their influence which they exert, as well as the threat or the perceived threat that they pose to regional stability. There's a growing recognition among many Arab and Muslim rulers that Israel is a permanent reality, whether you like it or not, which cannot be destroyed. Israel is not going to be thrown into the sea. It is here to stay. There is also an attitude or perception by some in the region that if the Israeli-Palestinian peace track has been stalled, then perhaps an outside-in approach, looking at the Arab countries outward, might have the potential to influence the Palestinians if they can understand the peace dividends that can be achieved once normalized and diplomatic relations are established. So looking at an outside in versus an inside out approach, one cannot help but notice, looking at the map of the Middle East, that all of this also falls against the backdrop of the rising Iranian threat and the sense of anxiety among some Arab states that Iran, through Iran's capacity with its proxy militias, has been able to extend its influence in a somewhat destabilizing way, they would argue, which extends from Tehran through Baghdad in Iraq, through Syria with the Assad regime, inside Lebanon through Hezbollah, and extending all the way in Yemen through the Houthis, which are an armed rebel group that receives support from Iran and overthrew the Sunni government several years ago. Another perception, which is flawed, but it's a perception that exists, is a belief by some in the region that the United States seeks to disengage from the Middle East and therefore is truly not a reliable partner or ally for some of these Arab regimes. And therefore, if the perception is that the United States is no longer a long-term guarantor of Arab security, it is in the Arab interest to look to the strong and stable Middle East countries to align with. And if Iran is not a viable option because they are rivals or enemies, somehow Israel in this context all of a sudden doesn't look so bad. One final thing to consider is it's important to recall that the countries that signed peace with Israel were never frontline confrontational states that engaged in military battles with Israel. When you look at the 1948 war, 56, 67, 73, the UAE and Bahrain, for example, even Morocco, geographically are very far away from the conflict zone. They, unlike Egypt and Jordan and Syria, did not lose territory to Israel. So all of this has enabled them or helped facilitate the possibility for a more warm peace and establishing diplomatic relations, because they never had that same type of experience as, say, a frontline confrontational state like Egypt or Jordan, and whose population is also much more intimately connected and sensitive toward the Palestinian issue. So that's important to keep into consideration. Look at the future outlook when we think about future prospects with the Abraham Accords. From what we know so far, the Biden administration appears committed to maintaining the spirit of the Abraham Accords and to build off on those agreements in the hopes of getting other neighboring countries to recognize Israel. However, some observations worth noting: since Biden took office, administration officials have downplayed or at times not even addressed the Abraham Accords by their name. They have not called them the Abraham Accords because they, for their own political reasons, I suppose, feel a reason not to want to give too much credit to their predecessor administration. They do acknowledge that they exist, but it's interesting to note you don't hear the name itself referenced frequently. And you also, as I previously mentioned, unfortunately don't hear as much fanfare, again, at least publicly, about the significance of the Abraham Accords. However, I will say that tomorrow, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will hold a virtual one-year anniversary ceremony commemorating the Abraham Accords, and he has spoken about using these frameworks of agreements to incentivize other Arab and Muslim countries to follow suit. So that is an important development, and worth noting. It's also interesting to ponder to what extent can we really expect the integration and acceptance of Israel and these neighboring Arab and Muslim signatory states. How far will security cooperation between these countries go? Will, for example, Israel sell Iron Dome technology to the UAE? Would they sell other types of defense systems to Bahrain? Probably not, but we do know so far that the trade and scientific and agricultural development and exchange is on the table and in the works, which is a positive achievement. Will other countries like Saudi Arabia, the prize in Israel's eyes among the Arab and Muslim states, recognize Israel and establish diplomatic relations? Probably too soon for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to do so. However, I wouldn't put it off the table entirely. After all, for one, the fact that the UAE and Bahrain, which are neighboring Persian Gulf states to Saudi Arabia, went so public in their acceptance of Israel and signing these accords probably leads one to believe they had to have gotten some type of indirect or tacit approval, a wink or a nod, by the Saudis to not totally upset the pan-Arab collective stance toward Israel. Most likely, if other Arab and Muslim states follow suit, one can anticipate countries such as Oman, maybe Mauritania and Northwest Africa to join. Some of the smaller countries, but once again, Saudi Arabia in Israeli eyes would be the real prize, because if the Saudis go forward, one can anticipate not just Arab countries, but other Muslim countries far away in Asia, like Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia. They too probably would follow Saudi's lead. Being mindful of the clock, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time if you do have any questions, I'll just say a couple of comments more broadly about the Biden administration's policies toward Israel and the Palestinians. We know that President Biden has a close personal relationship with Israel. This relationship actually dates back to 1973 when he was a young senator and he met with Prime Minister Golda Meir. He has much more of a personal connection with Israel and the people of Israel. There is continuity with prior administrations, both Democratic and Republican, about maintaining US aid toward Israel and ensuring that the United States will support Israel. I think what we have seen and what we will continue to see is when there is attention drawn toward Israel, there will be a reaffirmation to prior US administrations to the two-state solution. We saw a departure from that in the prior administration, but we are most likely going to see a return to the calls for a two-state solution. In other words, an independent Palestinian state living in peace and security next to Israel. So we're going to see the maintenance of US aid. We will also most likely see maintaining the US embassy in Jerusalem and maintaining the United States' decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So far, there has been no indication that President Biden will overturn those policies made under the Trump administration, as well as a continuation of recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, Where we will see a bit of change, again, going back to prior norms in the United States, will be with the Palestinians. And when it comes to the Palestinians, there has been interest in the White House to reopen the US consulate in Jerusalem to manage Palestinian affairs, to reopen the PLO mission, which had been closed in the prior administration in Washington, D.C. There's also been talk to restore around $235 million in US aid to the Palestinians, 2/3 of which will go to UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees. And we are also already seeing an indication of the United States re-engaging very publicly with Jordan, who is a critical player with respect to Israel and the Palestinians, as well as a long-standing US ally, a re-engagement with Jordan to stress Jordan's unique geostrategic role, whether it has to do with the fact that it has a custodianship role over the Islamic holy places in Jerusalem, which was enshrined in the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. Also taking into consideration that a majority of Jordan's population is ethnically Palestinian. Jordan used to rule over the West Bank, and therefore, for its own interests, it has a very strong attachment to whatever happens west of the Jordan River, because from its perspective, any instability on the West Bank could have a very destabilizing outcome on the East Bank. So you're seeing a re-engagement with Jordan, and King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to visit the White House over the summer. I can talk a little bit about Syria or Iran, but again, I do want to be respectful for everyone's time. What I'll say this very briefly about Syria and Iran, and then I'll conclude to allow time for questions. I think based on what we have seen so far, as well as pure and simple the realities on the ground, what one can expect in the Biden administration's policies towards Syria and Iran will be policies of containment and management. We should not expect any type of grandiose final status resolutions or solutions that will solve these very complex challenges and threats. Whether we look at the Syrian issue, the fact of the matter is, although Syria is an important player in the Middle East, it has never really been a strategic national interest of Washington. And since the 1950s, Syria has really been a close ally of Moscow. It has never had a close and warm or very good working relationship with the United States. And that has historically been the case, not just as a result of the past decade or 2 decades. This has historically been the case. Syria, when you really think about it and look at the map, Syria has been and continues to be one of the very few countries that does not have a good working relationship with the United States. And therefore, it doesn't mean that the United States does not have options, but Washington must be very realistic to the fact that Russia is the most powerful external broker in the conflict in Syria. And you also have Iran, you have Turkey extending its influence in northern Syria, you have various non-state actors, whether it's the Kurds or the FSA, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other jihadi terrorist groups that have various pockets of control and influence in the region. It's a very difficult country to solve, given the so many disparate external and internal actors influencing the situation. With respect to Iran, Iran is one of the most difficult foreign policy challenges for the United States in the region. To be very frank with you all, there aren't any good options with respect to Iran. It's thinking about what is the least bad option. If the goal is to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons or nuclear capability, you have the prospect of diplomacy, knowing full well exactly what type of regime you are dealing with, and being under no illusions that this is a very dangerous regime that has been at war with the United States since 1979. Engaging in diplomacy is a relatively low stakes option with the potential for big rewards. However, negotiations have proven extremely difficult, and Iranians have a reputation as being very tough negotiators, very skilled and tough negotiators. The prospect of increased sanctions and greater targeting of regime officials and entities to persuade Iran to comply with international norms is another option or strategy. There's also the military option, which we hear about from time to time, whether from the United States or Israel. While it is an option, it's probably a last resort option, which would create many additional challenges and threats for US and Israeli assets in the region. Unlike the Israeli strike in Iraq in 1981 targeting the Syriac reactor, there are multiple nuclear facilities, reactors in Iran. The Iranians have learned from the Iraqi experience. There are many reactors hidden deep underground. Iran is geographically much further away than Iraq. So that begs the question, if there was a military strike, and that's a big if, assuming the US or Israel is prepared to do that and incur all of the consequences of such a strike, it would most likely not eliminate the threat of nuclear capability, but only delay it. And that begs the question is what would happen during that interim period of delay? How would Iran respond? How would the US or Israel or both set red lines to ensure that Iran does not continue enriching uranium? Most likely, such a strike would trigger a far-reaching strike by Iranian proxies targeting US assets and Israelis across the Middle East. So no easy answers, in short. Still a very big challenge and threat for the United States. It seems to be, for the time being, the Biden administration is seeking to manage and maintain, contain the Iranian threat, not to fully resolve it. With that, I will stop here. I thank you so very much for your attention. And if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them either in the chat function or if you would like to use the raise your hand function. So I will pause here to see in the chat if there are any questions. And I do see that we have one question while you're gathering your thoughts. The question is, what do you think the new Israeli government's life expectancy will be? It's a great question, and it's a fair question, especially when you think about how diverse, politically speaking or ideologically speaking, that this Israeli cabinet is. You have parties ranging from the far right to Islamist parties. This is something very new and unprecedented in Israeli politics. So one might think, looking at the surface, with so many different ideological and political actors in a ruling coalition, surely that this will not last long and it will have a short shelf life. That is, on the one hand, a valid way of looking at it. Previous administrations, as we know, looking at Israeli history in the past, sometimes do not last their full term, and they do collapse because of different attitudes and policies. It's just too difficult to maintain a ruling majority coalition. On the other hand, there is some reason to believe that in spite of all of these differences of opinions and challenges inside Israel, that it may last. And if for any other reason, it may last simply because Israelis might not have much of an appetite to have an additional round of elections. As we all know, there were numerous elections back and forth over the years, and Israelis, in large part, many of them became somewhat election fatigued. So there's a sense that they're willing to give this new administration a chance. So we will have to wait and see. My guess is as good as yours. So far, if we just look at how things are, there is some optimistic reason to believe that it may last. But once again, Israeli politics are very unpredictable. So never say never. We just don't know. So thank you for your question. I will take another question that we have coming in from the chat, which is, how is the population in the signatory countries of the Abraham Accords feeling about them? This is a great question. As I tried to allude to in my talk, is what's really interesting, what distinguishes these peace agreements from the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan is there is a much higher, broader level of public support in countries like the UAE for Israel. Not for the Israeli government, but for the Israeli people. Now, I want to be very clear. This does not mean that Emiratis, Bahrainis, etc., are Zionists, or that a majority of them support Israel, or even the agreements per se. But where the UAE has differed from, let's say, Egypt and Jordan, is the rulers of the UAE and Bahrain spent several years over time to try to help set the tone with issues of tolerance and pluralism and inclusion, to help prepare their population to expect eventually some type of peace agreement with Israel. And what's really interesting is that if you were to look at social media sites like Twitter, for example, it is not uncommon to see young Emiratis on social media engaging with Israelis. They want to visit Israel. They want to engage with Israel. I have personally seen on social media Emiratis speaking in Hebrew to talk to Israelis. They are learning Hebrew to engage with Israelis. You just don't see that same type of reciprocity with Egyptians and Jordanians. While it is true that some Israelis like to vacation and travel in Sinai, they go to Egypt, they may have an interest to explore Petra in Jordan, you don't really see Jordanians or Egyptians visiting Israel. But when you look at a country like the UAE, per capita, there is a higher level of interest among Emiratis to get to know Israelis, to learn more about Israel, to visit Israel. And I think that is very positive, because ultimately what I think Israel and the United States wants is not just to have, which is a good thing, the government to government security relationship, but ultimately you want the people to people connection. You want Israel and the neighbors to feel like they are cousins, hence the Abraham Accords. You want them to feel like they are legitimate members of the neighborhood, not some foreign, far away, distant, illegal occupier in their eyes that has no right to be there. So I am optimistic based on what I've seen so far that in the case of the Emirates, in the case of Bahrain, we are seeing more positive interest among ordinary Arab citizens to have some type of understanding or connection with Israel. Again, it's not the majority, but it's something, and that's something that should be celebrated. I see another question, and I believe we have about 5 more minutes. I was told that this was 45 minutes. It'll stop at 2:15. So I'm just putting that out there for everyone's time. I apologize if we don't get to everyone. We have 5 minutes left, I see from the chat. Just so you know, if we don't get to all the questions, I think we have a link to my website. It has my contact information. I am more than happy to communicate with you offline if you want to continue the conversation. So I'm just putting that out there as a courtesy. Yeah, that's fine. But I'll just continue with the questions as I see them. We have a question about what do I think it would take for Saudi Arabia to establish diplomatic relations with Israel? You know, again, great question. I think that publicly, the talking points inside Riyadh is Saudi Arabia will not normalize ties with Israel and establish diplomatic relations unless there is a Palestinian state, unless the Palestinian issue is resolved. The funny thing about that is that's what the other Arab and Muslim states also said. And look what happened. It didn't stop them from doing that. And one anecdote about that is even during the most recent conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, which could have tested Israel's newfound relations with the UAE, Sudan, Bahrain, and Morocco, none of the Arab countries broke off relations. It may have been an embarrassment. It may have put some of these Arab states in an awkward or uncomfortable position. But in spite of all that public pressure that we saw in the international community, the agreements remain intact. So what I'm trying to get at is, I do believe it's possible. I do believe it's in reach. I don't know if there's any one thing that it would take in order for Riyadh tomorrow to say, let's go ahead, let's go forward. But I will just say this, in my opinion, I would not be surprised if within 5 years, Saudi Arabia does follow suit. I wouldn't be surprised. Might be wrong, but that's just my 2 cents. I will take one more question, and then I think unfortunately we will have to depart. But again, I'm happy to continue the conversation. Feel free to reach out if you have my information. The question is, what are the prospects for a renewal of the JCPOA with Iran? Great question. In short, I will just say the potential to have another type of diplomatic arrangement with the United States and Iran, but also the other parties involved in Europe, signatory countries with Iran. I hate to be pessimistic. I want to be realistic. I think it's very slim. I think most countries, even if you look at Israel, some recent statements put out by Israeli officials, they would probably prefer a diplomatic solution that would be agreeable to all parties involved. It would have to be satisfactory. But to your point exactly, when you really look at it, what are the prospects when we have no illusions about the type of regime we're dealing with in Iran? I am not so optimistic that we will see a type of JCPOA political solution. I have a lot of concern about this. I think that from the Iranian perspective, especially with their new leadership, they might feel totally fine and emboldened to continue playing a game where they're going to try to entertain diplomacy for the sake of talking, to try to see what types of concessions they can extract from the West without having to give up anything or much in return. I think they're going to buckle down, double down, and remain set, pretty much entrenched in their hardline position. I don't think they want to give up too many concessions, and so that's really, I'll leave it at that. I unfortunately I don't see a lot of hope or potential prospects for an agreement. There is always hope. There still is a slim possibility that we could see something. The challenge with that is it's going to take so much diplomatic finesse, not just from the US, but you have to get the Europeans really committed and on board to be on the same page with the United States. This whole idea really only works if everyone is not only on board and on the same page, but they're willing to enforce red lines that if Iran cheats or reneges on any of the agreements, that there will be serious consequences for their behavior. So with that, I want to thank Washington Hebrew for inviting me once again. Thank you all for joining. I want to, wish everyone a good Yontif, Yom Tov, a happy New Year. I hope everyone stays safe during these difficult times. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.